Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Josh Schimmels. I'm the publisher and the CEO of the Los Angeles Business Journal, and it's a pleasure to be here hosting today's webinar, Black Business Matters: From Awareness to Action. The events of the past several months have prompted the world to raise their voices for social change and racial justice. These voices have helped to open hearts and minds and to help create new dialogues. As our communities look for ways to speak louder and to be heard, the need to affect change has never been greater. And we feel that the business world is uniquely positioned to drive that change, particularly here in Los Angeles, where we thrive on diversity. The LABJ firmly believes that our community of business, which we describe as the vast and the compassionate network of forward-looking companies and visionary leaders, we feel it can play an important role at this critical time. We put this panel together as a way to embrace this effort and to find ways to engage in our communities. Our hopes are that by holding this conversation, we can turn awareness into action and that we can begin making a difference. We've got an amazing group today. We're going to cover a lot of topics, everything from access to capital and best practices for hiring diversity, to corporate accountability and ways to impact change and ways to get involved in our communities. We do realize that today is just a start, and we're going to cover as much information as we can. But we do hope to leave you better informed, educated, and more inspired to take action. So let me tell you how today is going to work. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce our panel and we're going to jump right into the discussion. You're able to learn more about each of our panelists by going to our website, which is the link that you see on the screen now. It'll also be there throughout the session. In addition, we are going to have a write-up in Monday's edition of the print version of the LA Business Journal, so you can read more about our panelist and moderator there as well. We're also going to be conducting a series of live poll questions this afternoon throughout the webinar. So when you see the question pop up on your screen, we'd love for you to take just a moment and participate by responding so that your voice is heard. We've set aside a good amount of time at the end, about 15-20 minutes, to cover audience questions that will be directed to all of our panelists and specific panelists as well. Many of you, in fact, a lot of you have participated with the questions already through the registration app. So thank you so much for the thoughtful questions that will be addressed to our group, many of which have been incorporated into our discussion and will also be held afterwards to follow up. For those of you who want to help us continue this conversation beyond today, you can do so using social media hashtag LABJ Black Business Matters. We're going to be sharing the entirety of this video on our website next week, and we'll also be sending it out in digital format to more than 60,000 business leaders throughout Southern California. After the Q&A, I'm going to share the results of the live poll that we conducted with each of you. Before we get started, I do want to take a moment to thank each of our sponsors. We can't hold this without them, and I want to thank them for obviously their support of today's conversation and the webinar, but really for everything they do on an ongoing basis in our communities. So thank you first to our 4 platinum sponsors: the Black Cooperative Investment Fund, Dykema, Green Hassan and Jenks, and Miller Kaplan. I also want to thank our gold sponsor, the DLR Group, and of course, special thanks to our community partner, the Greater Los Angeles African American Chamber of Commerce. And I want to give special thanks to its chairman, Gene Hale, who is going to be serving as today's monitor, and to its president, Angela Gibson Shaw, for all of their efforts in helping us shape this conversation. Thank you guys so much. All right, we've got a lot of topics and we've got a lot of great conversation to have, so we're going to jump right into the panel. It's my pleasure to introduce each of our panelists. First, we have Byron Allen, founder, chairman, CEO of Entertainment Studios and Allen Media Group. Derek Coleman, managing director, LA practice leader with Creative Financial Staffing. Robert Lewis, president and board chair of the Black Cooperative Investment Fund. Damon Lonnie, partner with Dykema. Karen Slade, Vice President and General Manager of KJLH Radio FM. George Swain, founder and CEO of George Swain Investments. And our moderator, Gene Hill, President, GNC Equipment Corporation and Chairman of the Greater Los Angeles African American Chamber of Commerce. Welcome, Gene. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Josh, and hello to everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all for participating in this very important seminar today, this forum today. I think that because of the time constraints, I won't go into too much of an introduction about what GLAC does. I think most of you know. So what we'll do is just jump right into the program. Is that okay? And any interview panelists can jump right in here on this question. What is the #1 challenge facing Black-owned businesses today?
Sure. Well, I'll jump on that one. Listen, first of all, thank you for organizing this. This is a very important conversation, and we have to take this opportunity to achieve real change. And the biggest problem facing African-American entrepreneurs, lack of access to capital, and capital that is not predatory. When I started my company from my dining room table 27 years ago, with a phone, and there were times that, they kept turning my phone off because I couldn't pay the phone bill. I didn't have access to capital, and people wouldn't invest, and banks wouldn't lend. And for the first almost 15 plus years of my business, I had to use factors who were charging me 27% interest on receivables from folks like PepsiCo and Johnson & Johnson and McDonald's and Procter & Gamble. And that's something that you can't survive. That's something you can't overcome. That's the most difficult thing. So we have to have the banks lean in, and the banks need to lean in at the very top, the chairman's office, and the banks need to become the chief investment diversity officer, where they actually know African-American entrepreneurs from our communities, and they actually know that they're lending money to African-Americans in our communities, not minorities, because the banks hide behind a minority record, and minorities are defined as white women. And they will say they have a great minority record, but if you look deeper, they're not lending money to African-Americans, which is why our home ownership is low, which is why our businesses are not properly capitalized with capital that is not predatory. That's the biggest problem.
Yeah, if I can jump in. That's right. So reading a Brookings report here just yesterday, it showed where 80% of the bank loans are made to white companies and only about 15% to African Americans. So you're right on point there, Byron.
Yeah. Josh, thanks again for putting this together. Again, it is very, very important that we have these discussions, but I want to add on to Byron. I had a conversation a few months ago with a banker, and one of the issues we were talking about was investment or lending in the community that the bank is in. Now, what's interesting is that was not happening. What was happening was that the bank was lending to the real estate people or developers who were building in the community as opposed to the community itself. So that's really interesting that you're bringing that up. I think that structured, institutional, intergenerational racism is the #1 factor with regard to what's happening systemically with us. That has been consistently reinforced by not only the government, but the media itself. That's a pretty tough 1-2 punch to recover from. Just imagine growing up at a time where your skin decides your fate. From years ago, and we all can relate to that. But that's something that's really touching for me, to think that my skin is not worthy. It's unclean. And this is what has been driven by the media for years, obviously. So I just want to say thank you to Byron for what he's doing. And in terms of changing the script and changing the game. So we have a lot of work to do.
Great.
And if I can jump in, I would say just piggybacking on what Byron and George has mentioned, particularly Byron, is access to capital. I mean, that's clearly the number one issue facing Black-owned businesses. All the data tells us that. We've known that for years. Being the board chair of the Black Cooperative Investment Fund, or BCIF as we call it, I mean, that's why BCIF was started, because we recognize in the community the lack of access to capital. We see economic empowerment is tied directly to social justice and equity. And so the ability to have access to capital, we believe it's a prerequisite to closing the racial wealth gap, which is what this is really all about at the end of the day. When you're talking about social justice and equity, you can't talk about those concepts without talking about the racial wealth gap. So, and you can't address that without addressing the lack of access to capital. So that's it, clearly number one.
Yes, let me say it as well, that, that's a very interesting term, let's call it access to capital, because that does not apply to everyone. Access to capital is a very unique term, because there are two ways you can go about looking at that. I want to tell you a story. Years ago, straight out of college, I was working for a brokerage firm, and my partner started the same day as I. We're two young guys, happened to be white, and we're working and canvassing and making cold calls and canvassing buildings. And I lived in New York at the time, canvassing buildings continuously to 5 p.m., 6 months straight. 3 months went by, and I received my first check, and it was for about $750. My counterpart walks in the office. We actually shared the same office, and he had a check made out to him for $60,000. That was a big wake-up call for me, because that, to me, that says, well, how'd that happen? Well, my dad introduced me to some people, his friends, and right away, to me, that's access to resources, access to capital that we just don't have. So how do we close that gap is really what we need to talk about, because, for all entrepreneurs, we should have that, but especially African-American and women of color. We need to figure out how to close the gap with respect to access to capital. And because it's not the same for each group of people.
And I would just offer and add that aside from bank loans, Black-owned businesses are also less likely to receive venture capital and investment from angel investors, with Black entrepreneurs receiving approximately less than 1% of VC capital. So there is embedded bias in the system that has to be addressed with respect to access to capital and access to credit.
Absolutely.
Underscore everything that everyone else has already said. First, I also want to thank Josh and the LA Business Journal for inviting me to participate on this panel. I appreciate it. So recent surveys that I've read for Black businesses in 2020, once again, access to capital is number one in terms of challenges that Black business owners are facing. Second, they also face challenges with respect to accessing marketing and advertising, and time management, of course, is also an issue. But in the literature that I've read recently, access to capital is the primary issue and primary hurdle to overcome.
What do you guys think about access to contracting opportunities to level the playing field. Many times African Americans just don't have the resources to access some of these contracts that are being let. Any comments on that? So we move down into the second part of this statement here, this question here. This sort of feeds off the last question. Capital is obviously vital to entrepreneurs, right? How are the sources and types of capital available changing? Are there any changes that you guys see?
Well, I'm not seeing the changes, but just to finish up on how we address this issue, is we have to have the top of the house. Management has to make the commitment. You know, the African-American entrepreneurs, extremely talented, very passionate, very committed, not running up to the wall, running through the wall, because we know we have very little to work with and very little margin for error. The top of the house has to make the commitment and say, 10% of our portfolio will be invested in the community. That has to happen at the top of the house. And until that decision is made and until the decision makers get to the table, nothing's going to change. And that's the reason I wrote an op-ed, Black America Speaks, America Should Listen, and what we need to do to never come back here again. And I published it at the Grio. Now I happen to own the Grio, and I bought the Grio because I knew that I was having issues with white-controlled media sharing our stories. And I also went and bought 16 full pages in 8 newspapers across the country. The Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, at the Washington Post. I spent $1 million of my own money. And what I said is, please don't use this opportunity to make it the Black Lives Matter donation movement, where you donate money to Black people as if we are a charity. That in itself, in my opinion, is racist. Because what you're saying is, I'm superior, you're inferior, and you need a handout from me. I'm not looking for a handout. I've never looked for a handout in my 59 years on this planet. I've only looked for a fair opportunity, but the opportunities have not been fair. And it has to come from the top. The top has to say, we're going to make sure 10 to 15% of our contracts are with African Americans, so we have true economic inclusion, not exclusion. And we were brought here from Africa to build wealth here in America. We're the only people in America who were brought here to build wealth in the way of slavery. And when we were here, when they brought us here as slaves, we were assets. And the moment they freed us, we became a liability. And that was the moment they started to murder us, lynch us, burn down our communities, and make sure they segregated us from capital to create what we are now witnessing is economic genocide. The only way that changes is the top has to say, we're including you, and whether it's contracts or bank loans or capital loans, you will be a part of our portfolio to the tune of 15%. This is a systemic problem at the top, and the programming is in place since the days of the emancipation and Jim Crow, and you have to change the programming. There are plenty of so-called business leaders who are not in business with African Americans, and if that's the case, you're not really a good business leader. You're a part of the problem, you're a part of the systemic racism, and it won't stop until you become a true leader, lean in and make sure you're doing business with numerous African American communities, not just that Black person, numerous.
How do you think a repeal of Proposition 209 would help George? How do you think that would help if we repeal Proposition 209? Would that make a difference?
Let me respond to what Brian has said. First of all, Byron, well said, incredible articulation of what needs to be done. I see that as a external possibility because we really have to take advantage of that. But there's another side to that as well, and that's from the inside, looking at the policymakers that need to take into account what you're saying, the money centers, the banks, the institutional foundations, government, of course, social initiatives. It has to be a collaborative effort because we're dealing with a systemic issue. So there has to be a systemic response to it as well. So I just wanted to.
So let me jump in and speak from the philanthropic perspective. We don't talk as much about the role of philanthropy in injecting capital into the community or within the broader realm of economic empowerment. So I've worked in philanthropy for many years, which in many ways is how BCIF was launched based on my experience in the philanthropic space. And oftentimes in philanthropy, you'll see high net wealth individuals or corporations, multi-million-dollar corporations, have no qualms with putting tens of thousands of grants, hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants in what I call the warm and fuzzy feel-good efforts, you know, and not to poo-poo those things because they're certainly important. They have value to a degree, things like free meals and tutoring programs, mentoring programs, but none of those things actually help people grow money. None of those things give the community access to capital. So if some of these same individuals, some of these same foundations, some of these same companies with their corporate citizenship programs, if they're looking to put capital into communities and businesses to help people produce products and services, help them create jobs, help them stimulate the economy, help them move up the socioeconomic ladder so that they can be in a position to have more influence. Those are the kind of things that will change the fabric of our community. So, you know, I've been calling out my colleagues in the philanthropic space for years to consider different types of priorities in terms of our grant making. That also means lifting up and elevating efforts that are outside of the traditional banking institutions. We talked a little bit already about the black businesses not being having access to capital through banks and credit unions, things like that. So you have the CDFIs that do a good job, but we need more than that. You're seeing emerging models that are based on formal or informal crowdfunding approaches. You're seeing giving circles popping up. You're seeing cooperative economics pop up all over the country now. Unfortunately, most of that is happening east of the Mississippi River. Out here out west, BCIF is the only one of its kind that we know of that is a nonprofit microlending org that pools dollars from all corners of the community for anyone who is invested in the well-being of the Black community. We're pooling our dollars and funneling those back out in the form of microloans. And that's really all about social justice and equity, because we see economic empowerment, closing that racial wealth gap as the primary means to getting where we need to go. So I invite folks to think about other ways we can close that racial wealth gap, other ways we can provide access to capital. We can do it in ways that we haven't traditionally thought of.
Thank you. The next question is for Karen and Robert.
I'm sorry, Gene, I think this is a very important topic that we need to stay on.
I agree.
So access to capital, again, it's not afforded to all of us, obviously. And how do we access it? How do we do that? Is it a phone call? Is it taking a meeting? It's not the same. It's like.
I think it's accountability. I think we have to hold people accountable. Some of the issues are with us as a community. We aren't holding people accountable. We as African Americans are the most powerful vote in America. The most powerful vote. Because quite often the white vote is split 50-50. So we as African Americans are the deciding vote, which is why they spend so much money to suppress our vote, which is why you always see on the news on voting day that Black folks have been lined up and can't vote, because we are the vote. We control who will live in the White House until the end of time when we show up. When we show up, you can get a President Barack Hussein Obama. When we don't show up, you lose a Hillary Clinton and you can get a Donald Trump. Now, our vote is powerful. So when we vote, we have to have an agenda. And our agenda has to be education, economic inclusion, and you have to stop environmental injustice in our communities because you're killing us. We don't have an ask. We didn't really even have an ask for President Obama, the first African-American president. I had an ask. I was very aggressive with him, and I told him I need two things from you. Number one, I need you to audit the banks to see if they're lending money to Black people, not minorities. Number two, the United States government has a pension fund from government workers that's greater than $1 trillion, a T, and little or none of it is managed by Black people. Black people, we gotta lean in and say to politicians and say to governments and pension funds, these pension funds out here who are getting a lot of their money from people of color, especially women of color, and very little of it is managed by African Americans or invested in our communities. And I would say, hey, we have to get a calculator, know our value, know our worth, and hold people accountable and say, this is not acceptable. And you have to do that. I didn't want to sue. I'm not a litigious person, but I sued some of the biggest corporations in the world, and they all got settled. But that's what I had to do to get folks to the table. Because quite often we, as Black people and entrepreneurs, we get hit with the 4 Ds. Number one, they dismiss you. It isn't that you don't have the talent, you don't show up and want to be there, they dismiss you. And then after you get frustrated from being dismissed, you speak up a little bit and they say, look at that, he's angry, she's angry, they discredit you. And then after you speak up even louder, they move on to that 3rd D, they demonize you. And then they move on to that 4th and inevitable D, they destroy you. Dismiss, discredit, demonize, destroy. And the only way you can get around that is you have to go to the top and you have to say, this is my value, and you're not going to get something in return from me, whether it's our dollars, our business, or our vote. And you're going to have to do something for our community. And we have to be better advocates for ourselves, and you have to demand. And at a certain point, it's not even a demand. It's just straight up, guys, I'm taking a seat at the table. And I'm telling you.
That's a great thought-provoking conversation we just had there. So what we want to do is try to move along here a little bit more. Karen, Robert, this is a question for you. Have your company business models changed, or have new initiatives been introduced to help support social justice?
Well, for KJLH, that's what we're all about. I mean, we are licensed by the government, and part of our licensing is contingent upon public service. So yes, we absolutely do that. What we have done in the interim, aside from working virtually like everyone else is, we are a music formatted station, but we have included more news updates and more public affairs programs. We have public affairs Monday through Friday. We've added a 6th day so that our listening audience can communicate directly with experts, hear the information firsthand, and speak their mind. They can speak up and share their voice and be heard. So we've done more of what we've always done, which is serve our community.
Robert, any comments?
Yeah, and BCIF. If you look at from its inception, it's been around 3 years now. It came about because a community of folks understood that the economic foundation of the African American community, it's been compromised. It's been compromised for years. These aren't new issues or concepts we're discussing here. I agree with a lot of what Byron talked about. And that's dealing with the big boys, as I call them. But we also need to be accountable for how we leverage the dollars we have. You don't have to be a high net wealth individual in order to be a part of this movement. So we have, the estimates are anywhere from 1.3 to 1.6 trillion dollars among the Black community nationwide. We all know the stats about how the dollar does not recycle in our community. You see 4 to 8 hours on average versus other communities, how it recycles for 17 days, 20 days, 30 days, what have you. We have to do a better job of that. BCIF gives people a platform so that they can invest dollars in an organization that is laser focused, intentionally, unapologetically about injecting capital into the Black community. We funnel those dollars back out to Black-owned businesses who oftentimes aren't able to leverage capital even from some of those alternative sources of funding. I mean, there's data that suggests, even with the recent PPP funding that came about through the CARES Act, there's an estimate of 95% of businesses owned by people of color, and we know many of those are Black folks, would not or have not received that funding, which is why in many ways you needed that round two, and the jury's still out in terms of how much has actually hit our community. So BCIF in no way is a novel concept, but it's totally underutilized, this notion of cooperative economics, pooling our dollars, doing what we can in the community to better leverage what we have, until, Byron talked about taking a seat at the table, and I absolutely 100% agree with that. My belief is that we can demand that or position ourselves to do that when our economic foundation is stronger, and people, they have to listen to us or else, or it impacts their bottom line. And as long as we continue to go without leveraging our dollar, recycling our dollars, pooling dollars, putting dollars back into our community, we're going to see the same outcomes.
Thank you.
We have to remember something very important when you talk about, when you mention that, Black people pretty much invented ride sharing, because when they didn't let us sit at the front of the bus and said, you must sit at the back of the bus, it was Black people who said, we will boycott the buses. And stayed off the buses for over a year. And we showed our economic power. And when the bus company had to determine, do I want to be bankrupt or do I let these Black people sit where they want to sit? They decided to let Black people sit where they want to sit and keep their money.
Exactly.
You must exercise the power of your vote and the power of your dollar. And you must have an ask and a demand. And if you don't have a demand, you will die poor. I guarantee you. You will die.
Agree. Hey, Demond, the next question is for you. Do you see any indications that large companies are committed to diversify their boards and executive ranks? Demond?
I'm sorry, I was muted. I'll say this, that, since the death of George Floyd, and the calls for social justice that followed, I have heard that more Fortune 500 companies have expressed an interest in diversifying their boards and their C-suites for qualified individuals. Now, the devil is in the details, of course. What does it mean if you're just expressing an interest, and who determines the qualifications? And that's picking up on Byron's point of, are we being dismissed even though we're qualified? And I think the question is interesting because I just participated on a call yesterday. It was a group of lawyers, African-American partners throughout the country, managing partners at law firms, and African-American general counsel at law firms. And this very topic was discussed because, of course, all of our communities are interested in it. And one of the takeaways, which I think we all know, is there are some very successful African-American entrepreneurs out there that sit on a lot of boards. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's the same person sitting on a lot of boards, and a lot of companies can take solace in the fact that they have a African-American, usually man, sitting on their boards. And so the discussion point yesterday's call was, one of the takeaways was, what do we do, and how can we go about actually increasing the number of diverse candidates on boards and in the C-suite, and what can be done? And for the National Bar Association, which is the largest and oldest national bar association for African-American attorneys, one of the things, the takeaways was to start submitting lists, creating lists nationally, no matter what part of the country they're in. Let's get a list together, let's create it, let's add to the people who we know already sit on boards, and let's have that list ready to go. Let's make sure the people on that list, their qualifications are lined up. Let's make sure that if any of us anywhere here, that there's an opening for a board, or some CEO indicates that they're expressing an interest to talk to a qualified candidate, let's have names ready to go. Let's have names ready to go, not just from an individual or from word of mouth, but let's have it from an organizational standpoint. I'm more familiar with the National Bar Association because I'm an attorney, but that could be true for Black MBAs or for accountants, for other groups as well. have the names ready to go and have those names recommended and hold people accountable, hold the corporations accountable. When they say they're interested, let's give them 2 or 3 candidates for whatever region it is to show here are some candidates that are good candidates for your board or for your C-suite.
Representation is important, but I think it's more important that the top of the house gives us real allocation. You know, you need these corporations, you know, look, I just went to the marketplace and I raised quite a bit of capital. And it was interesting. I raised a little over $1 billion. And I spoke to probably 25 trillion under management. And what I did find interesting were the folks who didn't participate in our loans. People who managed 600 billion, 5 trillion. And there was nothing there that they felt like they should own the piece of a loan where I'm pretty much, at this point, the only African-American that owns Big Four network affiliates in this country, the Weather Channel. The assets are primarily general market, but there was nothing there that they felt like they should lean in. And I knew then, if you're not leaning in on me, owning the Weather Channel, and our top line revenue on our EBITDA, which is substantial, then you're not leaning in on anybody. I'm an indicator, and that's a problem.
Appreciate that.
Trillions, and that's a problem.
As we talk about supporting Black businesses, this is for the panel. Should it be a priority to support? It should be a priority to support Black women business owners who experience double discrimination on the basis of race and sex. How do we combat this? Anyone? Panel?
Well, it's not a question. We have to lean in and we have to support African-American female entrepreneurs. Absolutely. And we have to make sure that they are leading the way. You have to, you know, there's an enormous gap, Black men and Black women, but you have to make sure that Black women are in the forefront.
Yes, and I'd like to add to that as well. You know, again, we have to surround, promote, and support our women, without a doubt. I think that plight that's an everlasting discrimination that's going to always be there. And knowing that, you have to really prepare yourself, just like all of us, and know your business, know your expertise, and really bring it to the table, and be persistent about it. And I think by doing that, you'll have a lot of support, and will have a lot of support going forward. So I think that's a really big issue that we have to maximize and really take control of. But more importantly, the women have to know that they are capable and way qualified to do what they do, and a lot of cases way better than us men. So that's just how we need to see them.
Thank you. I have a question.
If I can jump in there, Gene. If I can jump in there, Gene, just really quick. I would certainly, first of all, I defer to African-American women entrepreneurs to, their input, to really hear from them, as they're the ones, in the trenches. So, to hear from them and to find out what challenges they find unique to them. I think we all need to listen and be in tune with that. But the data tells us that African-American women-owned businesses on average generate about $24,000 in annual revenues versus the broader universe of women-owned businesses at around $142,000 a year. So if you look at that revenue gap, again, much of that is attributed to the lack of capital or barriers to capital. But you look more importantly at the fact that over the last 20 years, the growth rate of African-American women-owned businesses has grown by more than 500%. And that's far and away the largest growth rate of any other demographic of American business owners. So to me, it just makes sense. If you're about investing in the American economy, looking to make money, why wouldn't you want to support what is the largest growing sector within American business owners? It's Black women. So
And
it's a no-brainer.
I agree with that, but the issue is
the first entrepreneur in America, a female, to become a multimillionaire happened to be African American, Madam C. Walker. Exactly. So we need to remember that the first was a Black woman. So the very first champion of business very first millionaire Black in America, Black or white, a woman, a Black woman, Madam C. Walker. So that's a no-brainer.
And anecdotally, I can tell you most of the entrepreneurs I see out there on the grind, it's Black women.
Hey,
I see
Byron.
that.
Hey, Byron, give me a 30-second response to this question here. What advice do you have for the U.S. media, and how can they address diversity and minority opportunities moving forward?
I think the big issue is ownership. I'm about ownership. That's why I've been buying cable networks and I've been buying television stations, because I want to have a seat at the table. I had someone say to me, a white executive, why is it important to be Black owned and not Black targeted? And I said, well, I just had my daughter, Chloe, she's 11 years old. She had just been born. I said, well, you have a daughter, and she was just born. I said, can I control her image, her likeness, whatever she watches on TV, how the world sees her, how she sees herself? Can I control her self-esteem and her morale through media? And he said, no. And I said, because he was white. And he said, no. I said, then why do you think I would be comfortable with you controlling that for my daughter as she grows? So I'm taking a seat at the table, and I'm going to control how she sees herself and how the world sees her. It's important we own, and it's important that Madison Avenue does business with Black America, because Madison Avenue does not spend enough money with KJLH or Black Enterprise or Ebony, which just filed bankruptcy, or even for that matter, even my networks that are African American targeted. They don't value the African American consumer, and a lot of the platforms that are African American targeted get completely shut out, and not one penny of ad dollars, and they pull $1 trillion out of our communities.
Thank you, Byron. Thank you. Next, Derek, Karen, Damon, you can jump in on this question here. Recruiting diverse talent is key to having an inclusive workforce. What are some methods that that can be employed to promote diversity and inclusion in business?
Well, it is actually important to note that there's never a one-size-fits-all approach to any organization's diversity hiring needs. Every organization will require a different approach. And a few recommendations I would offer leaders that are intentional about advancing the diversity within their organization is you have to institute and implement an implicit bias testing and training program. There's biases that unless you uncover what those are, you could be making bad hiring decisions and not recognizing that there's bias in the judgment of that. So to acknowledge your own biases, which may affect the judgment, the end result, you have to standardize aspects of a recruitment process so that you can minimize the effects of bias on the final hiring decision. And I think that also you could select a diversity-rich image for your website. I think the company's website, you want to look at the websites, look at leadership and see people that look like you, and you want to feel that you belong. And so I think that we have to actively source candidates, and you have to, really be intentional about diverse candidates. And I think some of the methods are, if you can uncover the bias, and that's to me just I'm so passionate about that. I just think that, most folks don't think that they have biases, and they do. And it's okay to learn what they are, but you have to be willing to have the conversation, evaluate yourself, and be self-aware of what those are. And so I say, finally, even if you're looking for, in the universe I am in, accounting and finance, if you're looking for accounting and finance talent, partner with the National Association of Black Accountants. There's roughly about 9% of all of the 1.9 million accountants and auditors in the US are Black. But the number of Black accountants drop off significantly in a smaller subset of certified public accountants. So out of 650,000 CPAs in the United States, there's only 5,000 that are Black, according to the National Association of Black Accountants. So minority professionals are heavily, heavily recruited, but if they don't feel welcomed and see people who look like them, they are more likely to go elsewhere. So in my opinion, that's in the inclusion part that is still lacking, and we have to embrace inclusion.
Thank you, Eric.
I like to underscore. I like to agree with Derek on that. I think that's absolutely right. I was going to say that recruitment is very important, but so is retention and inclusion. and advancement. I think that any company of any size should be committed to all three. I think you have to have a mission statement that's written, diversity and inclusion mission statement that's written so everyone can be accountable to know what it is. I think you have to have, if your company is big enough, you should have, like my law firm is big enough, fortunately, where if you have a diversity and inclusion committee, have management on it. Have the highest management on it, the chairperson or chairwoman of the firm, high management on the firm for a diversity and inclusion committee, because they can drive whatever the criteria are for your diversity and inclusion standards. They can help drive and make sure that communication is being conveyed to everyone in the company and everyone in the workplace. And it's just critically important because you can even tie diversity and inclusion standards to job performance. At the end of the year, it's nothing better than to have a question on a self-evaluation form. What have you done to promote diversity and inclusion within the last year? Holding people accountable, but it has to happen with a clear statement that's written for everyone to understand and to follow, and follow up in terms of annual reviews where people can actually address that issue and focus on it year after year.
Yeah, let me also say that, we've been talking about diversity and inclusion for years. And it's really easy to talk about when we talk about it in the abstract. But when you bring it down to a personal level, attitudes change. And why does that happen? And that's what we really need to talk about. Why are these attitudes changing? Because when we're talking about it at a 30,000-foot level, it's pretty easy to talk about. But when we talk about fear and competition and loss of job, or things of that nature, it becomes very personal. And that's where I think we have to really focus in order to create a ground-up approach with respect, instead of a top-down approach, with respect to addressing diversity in the marketplace.
Thank you all.
I would jump in.
Yeah, go ahead, Karen.
I think that it's critical to go top down and bottom up. And once you hire, so let's say you have a diversity officer, an inclusion officer, and they're doing all the right things. They're interviewing, they're going out to the schools and recruiting. Once you've made a great hire for your company, make sure that they have the training and all the resources and the tools that they need to be successful and to do the job that you hired them to do. Don't just tick a box and say, I have a minority female, I have a Black, don't just do that. You want them to be successful and bring all their talents and skills to the forefront. And that's a good hire for you.
Mentor them and position them for success is what she's saying. Position them for long-term success and mentor them like they are your child. I was really fortunate. I got a really good mentor when I was like 19, 20 years old. He was one of the most successful TV producers in the business, and he taught me a lot. That was a special gift that I got from God. Mentorship and being shepherded and positioned for success is very important.
Okay, so we're going to have some audience questions pretty soon. So another question here is, what do you see as the biggest barriers to expanding a diverse pool of talent? And how can companies engage employees to contribute to more diverse hiring practices? Let's go, Derek. Come on, either one.
I would say companies should examine their current strategy for diversity, inclusion, and belonging. How does the company approach diversity and inclusion from an overall perspective? And for me, you got to start with it should be a data-driven approach, hiring more diverse talent. If you want to hire more diverse talent, you have to create a change and start with data, then take the data and transition that into action. Key steps that you need to be concerned with is accessibility, increase awareness, and create a system of accountability. There's 3 parts to the HR talent cycle: talent acquisition, talent retention, and talent development. From a talent acquisition perspective, if you fail to think about diversity, you limit the size of your talent pool. Companies who want a talented and diverse new hire should really consider recruiting outside of the usual spaces. Employers need to be thinking about markets they target, schools, regions. You may have to look beyond the normal spaces and places and search the uncharted waters. Who knows who you may find at that point. And then when it comes to retention, I completely agree with Byron. Set them up for success. You have to have a strong diversity initiative combined with the strong inclusion practice that will help foster an environment where minority groups will want to stay with the company. If you're a minority and you work with a great company, guess what? You're going to tell everyone you work for a great company. And that will inspire others to want to come work for that company. And you'll be more productive and you'll stay with that company longer. And then lastly, when it comes to talent development, if you want talent, like I said, you got to keep developing them. It is important to understand that development practices are most effective in connecting with the target group that you're searching for. So diversity and inclusion as relates to talent, from my perspective, should be a long-term commitment within your HR strategy.
Okay.
And I would just echo that quickly. I know we're pressed for time, that I think a couple of the biggest challenges are complacency. People who have maybe participated in a diversity and inclusion initiative during their work lifetime 1 year, they think that's enough, I did something. I think that's unfortunate. And the other is diversity fatigue. If you are in a company where you are championing the diversity cause, year after year after year, you can become fatigued. One of my partners in one of our other offices coined that phrase, and I think it's accurate, that those are two big challenges that we have to overcome. And I repeat what I said earlier in terms of just holding companies accountable. I think if you want to establish diversity and inclusion throughout your workforce, you have to make it personal to each person. And sometimes that's just an economic thing if it's not a moral issue for people. And that is asking them, driving them in their job performance reviews, what have you done to promote our diversity and inclusion issues over the last year?
Great. Hey, Robert, what are your thoughts on how we hold corporations accountable to their pledges to support anti-racism and equality in the workplace?
George earlier that talked about, we've been talking about these issues for years. And, for many people, we talk about this being, an awakening for America. For the Black community, our lived experience is the movement. We manifest the movement every day. And so I think about Dave Chappelle's 846 documentary, and he talks about being just exhausted with having to explain things that seem so obvious, with having to explain why a thing is a thing. And I think for how we hold these corporations accountable in their pledges to social justice and equity, for me, it's looking at substantive action they're engaged in. That, for me, that's three things really. One is, are they investing dollars, investing their financial resources in efforts like a BCIF that is specifically intentionally directed toward addressing the racial wealth gap, that are focused on economic empowerment? That's one. Secondly, does their staff from the top to the bottom, does it reflect their professed values on social justice and equity? Third, who are they partnered with? Who are they aligned with? What individuals, what other businesses are they aligned with? Are they aligned with folks who are pushing the agenda for social justice and equity forward, or folks who are trying to hold it back? And depending on where they stand in those three areas, Byron talked about this a little earlier, we need to withdraw our dollars. It's simple. It's not a novel concept. It's one that I have been encouraged to see. There seems to be a momentum behind it from conversations I have, listening to talk shows, different discussions I'm engaged with. It seems like there's really growing momentum around the fact that we can really get change by flexing our financial muscle. And if we withdraw our dollars for those corporations that aren't living up to their pledge and are just engaged for the moment and not the movement, not the long haul, we'll see what happens. When you affect the bottom line, you get change. And I'm a washed up jock, so I refer to a lot of sports analogies and metaphors and all that. So for those that are in tune with what's going on in Washington, D.C. with the NFL team out there, they have an owner that pledged he would never change the name of that franchise. And what happens? More than 80 sponsors worth billions of dollars. They say, you know what? we're no longer cool with this name either. And all of a sudden, the name is being changed from someone who professed it would never happen. Why? Is it because Washington's owner is now supportive of or concerned about the plight of our indigenous brothers and sisters? Not at all. We all know that. We know what it's about. It's about the bottom line. So that's how we hold them accountable. We see how they respond in those three ways. Are they investing their dollars in efforts that address the racial wealth gap, supporting the BCIFs of the world? Do they have the workforce that reflect those values, and who are they partnered with? And that's how they do it. And if they don't do it, then we withdraw.
Thank you so much, Robert. Fascinating views. You know, we did promise everyone that we would get to audience questions. Before I get to that, a couple of things that I wrote down and took some notes that really stood out to me. First off, when on the topic of diversity and inclusion, Byron, I loved your comment. Mentor them like they're your child. Derek, I thought it was really important that you mentioned not only is diversity and inclusion lacking, but perhaps the advancement portion of that statement. We can do better and we need to do better. George, I love your comment about the need to surround, promote, and support. And then the consistent message, which, you know, as a media outlet and publication certainly tells me we need to write about it more, which is the consistent comments and feedback of the access to capital, the issue of access to capital and loans, and the ability to grow businesses and build businesses. So we are going to move to audience Q&A right now, and then I'm going to hand it back to Gene. The first question I'm going to actually ask you, Gene, because I think you're probably best suited, but others can join in as well. So Gene, the question came in from the audience: how can business leaders get involved in their local communities to help build an infrastructure of mentorship and growth for our younger generations?
Well, one of the ways they can get involved is that they partner up with some of the local minority business organizations. And within those organizations, you have young people, you have students, college grads who are trying to make a way for themselves, and grab those kids, mentor them, and then also provide scholarships for them. I think that for what we do at the Greater LA African American Chamber, we have two programs. One is a BEP, Business Evolution Program, where we mentor companies and also along with their owners. Then on the other side, we have an educational fund where we provide scholarships and we mentor those students as we go along. So I think those are some of the things that I think that you know, our high profile African Americans ought to spend more time doing, getting involved at a lower level, and just really seeing what the community is all about in terms of where the kids are. And I think you could be more hands-on that way.
You know, you have to lean in on the education part. You know, when I went on the road, what I found is that as I went on the road to raise this capital, and we pitched a couple hundred meetings, whatever it was, and over $26 trillion, a huge amount of capital. What I found was a lot of times the brothers and the sisters were in the lobby, security checking me in. And when I went up the elevator to talk to the folks who had the money, quite often it was young white kids in their 20s and 30s managing trillions of dollars. But the common denominator, they went to Ivy League schools and got their business degrees and their law degrees, and they went to Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Stanford. And if you look at our population of almost 14% of the population in America, but we're only 1% or 2% of the population of these business schools that these private equity firms, Wall Street firms, and big corporations recruit from, then we're never going to close the gap. So what we have to do is be smart about it, and we have to say, hey, big schools that all the big corporations are recruiting from, we need our kids to represent 14% of that student population. And if you want to really help and lean in, I need you to take some of these kids to your alma mater and say, I need this kid in this school, just like it's one of my kids. I need us to lean in. And by the way, I'm going to help fund their education. But it's hard to get a seat at the table at some of these schools where the big corporations and Wall Street are recruiting from, and that's a game changer. You do not get a President Barack Hussein Obama without Harvard in his bio, and you don't get the head of Merck Pharmaceutical, one of 2 or 3 African Americans running a Fortune 500 company, without Harvard in his bio. So we have to put more energy into getting these kids finance in their education and into schools where these big corporations are and Wall Street firms are recruiting out of. It's a big gap there, and you can see where Black people are going to be based on our student population today on the Ivy League schools, and it's a low single digit.
Thank you.
Yes, well said, Byron. Let me ask, do you think that something like that can happen at the community level, or should happen at the community level?
USC. I mean, what is the Black student population of Black kids in a school in the middle of a Black and brown community? I mean, are we 15% of the student population of USC? The USC has a ton of money. Start financing those kids in business school and law school. UCLA.
Okay.
What changed my life? My mother had me 17 days after her 17th birthday. I'm born to a single Black girl in Detroit, Michigan in 1961. But what changed my life was my mother got into UCLA and got her master's degree in cinema TV production from UCLA. And that opened a lot of doors. It starts with education. That's huge. You got to get that right. And America knows that. And America needs to lean in and open up those opportunities, open up those seats, and finance these kids. I think every kid in America should get through college with no debt, and we should pay for it as a matter of just America needing great intellectual capital to compete globally. But especially Black kids, the furthest left behind.
Another audience question here for Byron and Karen. The question is, do you feel it's important for consumer corporations in the marketplace to place media buys on Black-owned radio stations and other media in the market?
Of course I do. Look at it this way. African-American consumers, we spend a lot of money. We buy the product. Every product that we buy from a major corporation, that we are investing in the success of that company. So it's good business for that company to in turn put money back in or reinvest in the community of consumers that buy their products. By advertising on a company like KJLH, you're putting money back in not only to a Black owned and operated company that hires Black people from the community, but we're putting money back into the community, into the pockets of the consumers that buy their product. So it's just good business to support those that support you. It's pretty simple.
Great.
And I would just add to that, Karen, I think that corporations can support Black-owned businesses if they just diversify their supply chain from the maintenance company they use all the way to their employee benefits broker. I mean, if you're not searching, to me should be an easy fix for corporations, which in turn helps the community.
Which leads into the next question. How can businesses, companies, and organizations implement open discussions in the workplace? Anyone?
Well, I think they don't shy away from it first and foremost. I mean, they create safe spaces and create opportunities for people to participate in those safe spaces, find creative ways to incentivize open discussions. But most of all, the workforce, their staff, it has to reflect their professed values. I mean, if they are professing the values social justice and equity, I mean, there's clearly a disconnect when you see senior leadership that's mostly white men or men in general. So they, it's about action and demonstrating what you profess to value. But if I can, and maybe we can loop this into that question some way or another. I love what Byron just talked about in terms of education and positioning our young people to get into those schools that are creating the pipeline into those positions of influence where they are the keepers of the pot of gold, so to speak. I want to ask whether it's Byron or others on the panel, do we see a place for HBCUs
Yes,
in that?
Absolutely. Those schools are underfunded and they need to be funded. And they need to be, they're always in need of more capital. And I wrote about that in my op-ed, Black America Speaks, America Should Listen, which I published at the GRIO. And I love for everybody to read that. listen, I think the bottom line is enough with the analysis paralysis. We need to stop talking and we need to start doing. When people
Right.
want to do, they can figure it out. You have to they have to make the decision. I'm making the decision that inclusion and diversity isn't just a cute idea. It's a part of our Constitution, our personal Constitution. But the reason why people keep talking and they can't quite figure it out is because we're really talking about not black or white. We're talking about the great American green economic pie. And what you have is people don't want to share any of that pie with you. And they have positioned it so you fail. And what you have to do is say, look, the imbalance isn't working anymore. And we learned that from Martin Luther King. Two Americas will not survive. We need one America. And that means more balance and more economic inclusion. And you're going to be a better business because you have now included more of the people in your community.
Here's an interesting question for you all. Byron, you can probably pick up on it as well from the audience. How do we encourage Black-owned businesses to open in communities where few exist? That's an interesting question.
I would say don't do it. Go, be careful. Don't go where there isn't any money. I have purposely made it a point not to play in what I call the Negro leagues. I made it a point to make sure I, as a businessman, I look at myself as an economic entrepreneur, as an athlete, an economic athlete. And I play in the major leagues. I go after businesses that are global. I go after the same businesses that my white counterparts go after. That's unique about me. I'm one of the first to buy businesses traditionally owned by white people because I made a decision. I'm not going to play in the Negro leagues. Not enough money there. I'm chasing billions. And first order of business, position yourself to succeed. So go where there's plenty of capital. If it's not billions, then it needs to be trillions, but don't chase millions. So go where the money is and go and do business where it's global and you have unlimited upside. One of the biggest mistakes we make as entrepreneurs quite often, sometimes we start in places where it's just too small and there's not enough money to go around. And franchises can't even make it, well-known franchises can't even make it in those neighborhoods. If you see a McDonald's die in that neighborhood, keep on driving. You know, you have to go and don't play. And that's a trap. You're Black, only go after Black. You know, when I put out my very first movie, everybody thought, well, he's Black, he's gonna put out a Black movie. I went out and put a movie. I put out a movie about the Kennedys, Chappaquiddick. My first movie was a shark movie, which ended up being the biggest independent movie of that summer because I didn't want them to put me called 47 Meters Down. I didn't want them to put me in that black box. He's Black, he only plays Black. I want them to know, no, he plays global. And that's the entrepreneurs that we have out here today. They have global talent. And you need to play at the global league because that pays billions and trillions and not dollars.
Well, I think on that note, we can see that this is a conversation that not only should, but will continue. We would love to host more of these. We'd love to continue to write about it. I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you, Gene, for being our moderator. Thank you to all of our sponsors. As promised, before we get off, I do want to share the results of our live poll questions. So the very first question was, as a Black business owner or executive, have you had difficulty getting bank loans and access to capital? 20% said yes, 3% said no, with a large number that didn't apply. So of those who did, about 90% have had challenges. And I think that mirrors what we've seen. Has your company introduced new employee training programs to address diversity awareness in the workplace? The good news is 47% have. Another 31% are working on it, and 21% already had them in place. So still work to be done. Do you think the US media does a good job of addressing diversity and minority opportunities? Well, this is pretty clear. Look at that. No. 93% said there needs to be more depth of coverage. Our next question. Are you satisfied with the diversity of your company's workplace? 33% said yes. 41% said we have some diversity, but we could use more employees from underrepresented groups. and 26% said no, not enough, we need to improve. Still more work to be done. Does your company focus on recruiting diverse talent? 61% said yes. 22% haven't in the past, but are going to moving forward. 20% said we try our best, but it's not a factor in our hiring decisions. And then our last question, has your company reduced or canceled its Facebook advertising and marketing in support of the July boycott? Of those who it did apply to, roughly half either eliminated or reduced their spend. The other half didn't make any changes. Well, on that note, and on the quote that Byron shared, "Two Americas will not survive," I'd like to thank you all for tuning in. I want to remind you that this recording will be available on the LA Business Journal website. We'll also be sending this out in an email to approximately 60,000 business leaders early next week. And we hope that you'll share this. We hope that you'll continue in the conversation. And we want to thank all of you for joining us. And we look forward to talking soon. Thank you so much.
Please vote.